Welcome to St. James on this Good Friday. I am James Henry, the pastor here at St. James on the West End in Alexandria, Virginia, and wherever you are, in person or online, we welcome you tonight. We welcome you to our live experience of Good Friday, but also if you're watching later on or if you're listening later on our sermon podcast, welcome. Welcome. We know that God's Spirit is big enough. If it's big enough to cover the whole universe, we assume that it's big enough to cover wherever you are and connect you with us and us with you. It is a rainy day here in Alexandria, it's been a dark and gray day more or less throughout. And a bit of a chill in the air. Seems very appropriate for a Good Friday. For years, one of my biggest questions about Good Friday worship was what was so good about Good Friday. I don't know that I'm exploring that particular topic tonight. I do have some things to say about the story, about this last day in the life of Jesus, and what that means for us, what the story tells us about love and about hope and about brokenness and about death itself. So as we gather wherever we are, in person or online, or listening, I want to take just a moment to invite you to be where you are, to be present. Not to run away from this experience, because if we're being honest, for the longest time, the least attended service in the Christian church was a Good Friday. Sped right from Palm Sunday and the triumphant parade into Jerusalem to Easter Sunday and resurrection, without ever having to deal with and sit with death and the reality of death. Our Buddhist siblings in the world actually make it a practice to ponder their finitude, their limitedness, their death, that it's coming, not in a negative way, but in a realization that we have this life, we have this moment. And if I can really be here right now and experience all that's coming to me in this moment the best I can, I might really experience this eternity, this hope, this connection that God has for me. And maybe I'll experience a little bit of that death that is meant to come in this. So we're going to breathe, which we get to keep doing as long as we're alive. And we're going to be present in this moment, not run away, and focus ourselves, bring ourselves to this moment of crucifixion. So I want to invite you to breathe in and breathe out. Wherever you are, to breathe in and to breathe out. Recognize in that breathing the preciousness of the gift of breath and life. Recognize that this is the day we remember that Jesus breathed his last breath. And so we're mindful of that. So be present with us as we continue to worship and talk a little bit about Good Friday.
Our reading for today comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 1 through 16. So Pilate ordered that Jesus be flogged. Then the soldiers wove a crown out of thorns and put it on his head and dressed him in a purple robe. They went up to him repeatedly and said, "All hail the King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Pilate came out once more and said to the crowd, "Look, I'll bring him out here to make you understand I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the purple robe and the crown of thorns, and Pilate said, "Look upon the one you accuse." When the chief priests and the temple guards saw Jesus, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate told them, "Do it yourself. I find no reason to condemn him." "We have a law," the temple authorities replied, "that says he ought to die because he claimed to be the only begotten of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. He went back into the praetorium and asked Jesus, "Where do you come from?" Jesus didn't answer. Then Pilate said to Jesus, "You refuse to speak. Bear in mind that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you." "You would have no authority over me," Jesus replied, "unless it had been given to you by God. Therefore, the person who handed me over to you has the greater sin." Upon hearing this, Pilate attempted to set Jesus free, but the crowd shouted, "If you set him free, you're no friend of Caesar's. Anyone who claims to be a king defies Caesar." Hearing these words, Pilate took Jesus outside and seated himself on the judge's seat at the place called the Pavement, Gabbatha in Hebrew. Now it was almost noon on preparation day for the Passover. Pilate said to the people, "Here is your king." "Take him away," they shouted. "Take him away. Crucify him." Pilate asked, "Do you want me to crucify your king?" The chief priest said, "We have no king but Caesar." Then Pilate handed Jesus over to them to be crucified. Our video for tonight comes from the work of the people, and it's very powerful imagery about the crucifixion and what it means for us, I think. Watch this now.
On that day, that Friday, he was made to suffer, inflicted by our transgressions, burdened by our iniquities, tortured by our violence, more than what he could endure, hatred made real and palpable, anger and cruelty against the body, lashed out on the skin, against all that was true and good and beautiful. A mob lynching the innocent against the divine Son who just wanted to be one of us. Cutting down the tree to carve out a cross grown from a seed, a plant whose life's goal was to reach the sun and provide air to this world, the sustenance of breath. But people of power made it into an instrument and tool to execute a political prisoner. Someone who was deemed a traitor because he sought a world better than our own. One where we sit at the table together, where the sick are healed, their wounds mended, and liberation is pronounced to the imprisoned, to speak against the principalities of this world, resisting their strategies of violence, declaring the day of the Lord. But all these dreams were dashed on hardened hearts, hearts not able to see God with us, present, breathing the same air, laughing, crying, sleeping, being with, standing beside, needing us as much as we needed him. Except for the few women who followed him to the end, he was abandoned, left to die, until he breathed his last, until he forgave his offenders, executed with thieves, death row inmates, hanging their heads with him, until the clouds darkened, their chests sunken, until the light of the world was extinguished by merciless hands, making the brilliant sky dark, eclipsing, crucifying God, open God, vulnerable God, tender God, who hung there, as dead as that tree.
I wonder if we could take just a moment and pray together before I bring tonight's message. Loving and vulnerable God, you are always with us, even when we do not know it. The Apostle Paul said that in you we live and move and have our being. There is never a time we're not in you, of you, around you, and we are meant to manifest your presence, as your Son Jesus did. Help us, O Lord, to be present, as tough as this day may be, as it is to face death and our limitations. Let us be present to the death of Jesus in ways that will help us see ways to live more fruitfully and faithfully as your people. We ask this in the name of the crucified one. Amen. You know, one of the important skills that they taught me many years ago, first in licensing school when I was licensed to preach. I was sent to licensing school in 1983. And then when I went off to seminary and finished seminary, they taught me how to take the story of the crucifixion, the resurrection, and to make a beautiful theology out of it. Theology, if you just get to the root of the word theology, it really just means talking about God, talking about the experience. But it makes it more comfortable for us if we can hang all that happened, pun intended, on our own ideas about what it was, rather than the truth of the death, the painful and brutal, violent killing and execution of a man on a cross. The raw truth may just feel like too much to take, too much to absorb. I can tell you for myself that with all that training, I can keep myself pretty anesthetized through Holy Week. Ready to handle Good Friday, just hanging there long enough so I can get to Easter and resurrection, new life. Woo! If only I don't have to think about the only way to get to resurrection, which is through the crucifixion. My favorite preaching teacher, Bobby McLean, when I took preaching in the black tradition, Dr. McLean, Bobby McLean was a powerful, he's dead now. What a loss he was, because he was a powerful preacher and a civil rights activist. But I still remember sitting in the class with a number of my African American siblings and one other white person like me in the preaching in the black tradition class, when he said, "We all know you cannot get to Easter without Good Friday. There is no resurrection without crucifixion. There is no new life. There's no new life without death." So the hardness of Good Friday, if you will, for me, is that sense of what was destroyed that day. You know, the promise of a man somewhere between the age of 30 and 33. We know he began his ministry when he was 30, and depending upon which gospel you use and how you count the years, he was in ministry between 1 and 3 years, so he was maybe 31, he was maybe 33. We don't know, and it's not important. It's not important. But somewhere along the way, this man who came and confronted the powers and spoke love and hope, who spoke truth, who brought healing and reconciliation, was an affront to a religious system who liked to be in authority and control. It's like any other religious system. Quite frankly, I serve in a religious system that likes its power and control, and it can wield that. You know, I've been told more than once by bishops, and but particularly by my immediate supervisors, to recognize that I was here at the desire and will of the bishop, and I could be somewhere else at the desire and will of the bishop, because power and authority are theirs to do what they wish. I don't mean to make it sound crass, but the truth is, all religious authorities don't take well to affront. We like to control the narrative. We like to say what Good Friday is all about, and we like to do it in theological ways that perhaps keep us at work, keep us in a job. Because after all, who's got the theological training? I'm standing right here. Now that might seem just a little bit on the crass side, and maybe it is. But the religious authorities were just like religious authorities today. If they said do one thing, they expect you to do it, and if you did something else, they weren't too happy. And the religious authorities in the first century did not appreciate Jesus stirring the pot, partially because it was an affront to their authority, and partially, I do believe, they were worried about the people, because you get the Romans ticked off and they'll start killing you. And they were, whatever you want to say about Roman authority, they were a killing machine. It was hard to beat them. They had a system of warfare that was daunting. Nations did not want to be on the wrong end of that. And these religious authorities wanted to protect the people from these weird ideas about loving your neighbor as yourself, but also from being wiped out by these Romans. And Romans didn't take too well to insurrection. And large crowds starting to go in a direction other than the direction they wanted the sheep to go. So there were plenty of powers arrayed against Jesus' message of hope and liberation and healing, because he didn't do it the way they wanted it done. And the best way to shut him up was to kill him. Now, in a way, that death is horrifying to us. Maybe more than in a way. Because if they can kill Jesus, they can kill anyone. That's what the other disciples had to be thinking when they went into hiding. If they can kill Jesus, they can kill any of us. We're unknown followers. We're the 12. Well, the 11 now. We're the unknown. Jesus was known. The crowds were on his side, and then suddenly they weren't. No wonder they went into hiding. We don't want to die. But what did Jesus teach us over and over again when he was alive? Is that we have to die. We have to die, and not just the physical death that comes later, but the death to all our ideas that we could know who God is and contain God neatly into our package. God doesn't fit into the St. James package, doesn't fit into the United Methodist package or the Church Universal package, because God is bigger than all of that. We get to get a glimpse of the ultimate truth, but the ultimate truth's bigger than any of us. And so if we watch really closely and are really present in a moment, I can see each of you in this room with me. I can't see you on the other end of the line. That's the challenge about the other end of our internet connection. I can't see you. But I can see an aspect, if I look closely and am present enough, I can see an aspect of God in those who are gathered in this space. And in every blade of grass. And every tree, including the one that came down on our property earlier this week when the wind blew through and knocked it over. God is in all those places reflected. So one of the things that died when Jesus died was all the imagined ways that God works. Now, we've put theology together over the last 2,000 years, but if Jesus represented God and he was meant to be the warrior king, at least that's what was expected, that would lead his people to freedom, that had to die with Jesus. Because that's not how God's love works. You can't violently force anyone, despite what the Crusades tried to do. You cannot violently force anyone to love, to believe in love. I can't force Linda to love me. She was wacky enough 31 years ago to sign on the bottom line and become my wife, and has loved me ever since. And I her. Through the tough and the easy times. And sometimes probably more than others. It's hard work, but it requires a vulnerability, because that's the only way love works. If there's no risk, there's no love. I'm sorry to say, if there's no risk, there's no love. There's there's lust, there's control, or any of those kinds of illusions you want to attach to it, but love cannot be born without risk. And that's what the incarnation, the birth, Jesus at Christmas time was all about, is taking an amazing risk. At a time when infant mortality was higher than it is today, much higher, Jesus was born among us. And he lived to adulthood. And then he risked it all to talk about the God that he knew, and to show us the way that God was not the God that sat like Zeus on a throne to throw lightning bolts at us. But this was the God who stopped at the side of the road and knelt down and talked to somebody. This was the God who sat down and let children come and sit on his lap. This was the God who dried the tears of the broken. This is the God who wants to bring healing to us, and not just physical healing. Because the word to heal comes from the very root to make whole. God would love for us to be whole. But in order to be whole, we've got to die to some of our illusions about how God's going to fix things. And realize we're called to risk, just like God did, loving. And that the more we risk, the greater the chances are some part of us is going to die. I have said this before, but it's a truth. It's a story from my own life, and that is when Linda went in the hospital and I didn't know what was going on, a part of me died. The part that thought I had some control, some authority, that I would always have, that Linda would never leave me. And physically, I don't think she ever will divorce or walk away from me. But someday one of us is going to die. And I lost a piece of my illusions about life in those 34 days. Some illusions about death and how close it is to any of us. Now, that could have made me bitter or angry or broken. It did make me a little bit broken, maybe a lot broken. But the wonderful thing it did for me is break me open. And you see, the death of Jesus broke the disciples open to see the world through new eyes. What they had put on Jesus, and there were 12 different opinions about who Jesus was supposed to be. King, Messiah, teacher, master rabbi, healer, Son of God, all of those titles. Attach them all you want. But attach them as you will, Jesus broke the mold of what it is to be Messiah, to be the Son of God, to be the eternal Christ, because he died. And he did it to show us love. He gave it all so we could see that love requires that level of risk and vulnerability. And there are no promises. There are no promises. God protects us, not even Jesus. God protects us from nothing and sustains us in everything. In everything. In the darkest night of their lives, the disciples thought it was over. They had to rethink everything they imagined to be true. Good Friday is an invitation to all of us, an affront that says perhaps you need to rethink who you think God is. If you're waiting for God to punish the bad guys, and we all have our list of who the bad guys are, and they look different. Could be a political party, could be people from another country, different religions, all those things. We got a list. Bad guys. We're waiting for God to punish them. Got another thing coming. Because Jesus showed us God would die first before calling the army out to obliterate whoever is perceived to be God's enemy. And in the Gospel of Mark, the very first person to recognize that Jesus was God's Son was not a religious person to begin with at all. It was the Roman centurion at the foot of the cross, the same one who crucified him, or at least supervised it. Centurions would have supervised it. When Jesus gave up his last breath, he said, "Surely this was God's Son. Surely this was God's Son." Not in power and glory with lightning bolts and thunder and loud booming voices from the heavens, but in the quiet last breath on a cross. That's what God looks like. Risk and vulnerability and love, inviting us to the same life and perhaps the same death. But perhaps the little death first, learning to let go of the things that are the illusions we cling to so we might really see what is true. That above all else, Jesus loved us. Above all else, God loves us and will risk it all. Risk it all for that. I don't have an assignment for you. You see, life is going to challenge your illusions. Perhaps it's challenged some of your illusions tonight. But the things you are sure are going to go your way don't always happen that way. The things about which you are sure in life maybe aren't as sure as you thought they were. The risk you took might not pay off the way you expected. You are going to have your illusions broken again and again and again. And God will be with you in it. The same God who protects you from nothing and sustains you in everything. One of the things we do always when we gather in one form or another is to pray. There are plenty of things on our hearts and minds, things we brought with us tonight, perhaps illusions that we are holding dear, that keep us moving through our lives. Perhaps it's the illusion of success, or control, or power through violence. None of those are true power. None of them are. But whatever they are, we're going to lay them before God in a moment of prayer. We'll pray silently together. I'll pray aloud for us, and then we'll pray the Lord's Prayer, a version of which will be on the screen behind me. Could we enter into a moment of silence together? Loving and ever-present God, In you we live and move and have our being. This day, we come as close as we ever do to recognizing that for us to celebrate a resurrection, someone had to die. Your son Jesus, the Messiah, died. As quickly as we'd like to rush through that, because it makes us uncomfortable, as quickly as we'd like to rush through and hold on to all of our illusions in this life, only to have them broken in our physical death, you invite us to a different kind of path. Your son invited us to a different kind of path, a path where we learned to die before we die, to let go of the things that are the illusions in our life so we might have a glimpse of the real. And it's much harder to do that than we thought. Those illusions hold us tightly. We imagine what it will look like for us to be successful, for us to be useful, for us to matter in this world, to make a difference. We don't want those illusions shattered. If we're being really honest, we don't want them shattered. And yet, bit by bit, some of those illusions fall away. Help us to find the ground that only is you. In the end, that's all Jesus had. That's all he had on that cross. Help us, O God, not to cling to the things that don't matter. To receive the gifts you give us freely and to let them go freely. Life comes our way on its way somewhere else. Help us to give ourselves away, to empty ourselves like your son. Help us to be willing to take risks and to be vulnerable, to be your people. We ask it in the name of your son, Jesus, the same one who taught us and modeled for us a prayer that we could use together. Our Father in heaven, holy is your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen.
Some of you may know, I've mentioned it before, that I grew up on a farm. And life on a farm means that there's experiences from the time when you're little with both life, seeing things born, and with death. And it's one thing when it happens with animals. And, you know, after I graduated from college and I felt like I was supposed to do something other than work at the IRS, I applied and went into the US2 program and was placed at the Christian Community Service Center in Houston, Texas. And I had been at CCSC, probably maybe 3 months. And I was kind of struggling because I'm an introvert, and I was having trouble trying to find, relationships outside of, work. And so I heard from the woman who was our volunteer coordinator. She helped out at an organization called Omega House, which is at the time was a still is a hospice for people dying with AIDS. And I was in Houston from 88 to 90, so really at the early end of the AIDS crisis when the majority of the people who were dying were gay men. And Omega House was right in the Bering community, so it was right in the middle of a very strong neighborhood. And so, as someone who didn't have a whole lot of social life, I picked the night that was available, which was Saturday night. Woohoo! So on Saturday nights, I would go to Omega House and I would volunteer. And I was there from 6 to 10 and met a really wonderful person, Martin. He was there too. And our job on Saturday nights was to do whatever the residents needed us to do. So if they wanted to have pancakes for dinner, we made them pancakes. If they wanted to watch Mommy Dearest, which we had some of the guys wanted to do that, we watched Mommy Dearest with them. Or whatever it was, that's what we did. The goal was to make sure that their time, however long they had, was as filled with love and presence as it could be. Now, at the time, I was in my 20s, and I was awkward and introverted, and so initially, I filled my time with tasks. I'd wash the dishes, I'd wash clothes, I'd make meals, anything I could do to avoid sitting at the bedside of one of the guys who was struggling or dying. And finally, we had this great nurse, Patricia, who would come in at 10 o'clock, and she was overnight, and she did all the serious meds. And Patricia said to me one night, Linda, you've got to stop hiding, because they may ask for pancakes, but what they really want is you. They want you to sit down with them and be with them. And so I started doing that, and it was awful and hard and wonderful and life-giving. And it was all of those things, because when you journey and you see death at its moments, as it's happening, or right before it happens, just like James described, I hadn't thought about this in a long time until James was talking. You become open to who and what is most important. And Good Friday is a time not to hide, not to scare away or to be afraid of struggling with death, struggling with our own death, struggling with and remembering the death of people that we love, and most especially understanding the significance of the death of Jesus and what he was willing to do because of his love for each of us and every person out there. So my hope is that on this night, as we leave here, or for those who are engaging online, whenever you're watching this and, thinking about this, is to remember that we have the opportunity to be changed by this death of God's love, this death, through God's love, to become the people that God knows that we can each be. And that requires us to be open and be broken open and risk and be vulnerable and not hide behind the tasks, but to sit in the middle of other people's pain and be present and laugh and cry and celebrate and all of those things, which are all things that Jesus did and all are a part of life. So go forth and know that tonight is a night for both death and for living. And go and embrace both, friends. You are loved. Amen.